and it's very difficult for them to disentangle themselves from this embrace of liberalism. That's partly what I'm trying to do. Just in parentheses, in party political terms, any movement becomes significant, it seems to me, when it reaches about 10%. A far right or a far left movement of 5 to 7% is not important. You can live with it, ignoring. When it gets to 20% or 30%, it looks as if the Front National in France is getting this way in the local elections, then you have to tackle it. But what I find fascinating about my colleagues and others is that they won't confront this. They just say, no, we're not going to talk about it, it's just populism. It's an extraordinary phenomenon of not looking reality in the face. It's an argument, obviously, I've had many times. There is one further factor I want to mention here. I think to some extent it's fortuitous, it's a matter of chance, that historically the proportion, the size of those whom we would today call the knowledge-based industry, intelligentsia, was relatively small in proportion to the rest of society. But the enormous increase in higher education has transformed this. I don't have figures, but I would guess in most Western countries we're talking about 2/5 of the population as the potential base for liberalism, which has a critical mass. And that critical mass is far greater than, and here I'm referring to Zygmunt Bauman's intellectuals and legislators, is far greater than the section of the population that Bauman was talking about when he wrote his book. I think it was published in 1988. And Bauman argued that these morally legislating intellectuals will be forced through citizenship into becoming interpreters. I don't think this is right. I think what we are seeing is the continuation of moral legislation. Just listen to any of the speeches made by liberal politicians. Now, this does take us back to the Enlightenment, and in many ways, and let me just add here that I accept that I'm a child of the Enlightenment, I can't be anything else. But in many ways, liberalism sees itself as the legatee and bearer of European Enlightenment, and obviously was boosted in this by its 5 great victories. But I think in practice, it has tended to abandon 3 of the central tenets of Enlightenment thinking. The Enlightenment stood for universalism, I think this is still there, but it also stood for the denial of privilege, knowledge, and status. Everything is questioned, open to question. Ernest Gellner, who was a colleague of mine many years ago, he died almost exactly 20 years ago, he talked about cognitive growth, scientific argument, the readiness to question everything. I think this is no longer true. I think that what we're looking at are closures, the epistemological closures I mentioned earlier. Some things are sacred. They're sacred. Well, there's always going to be sacralization. I can refer to Durkheim here. And I think furthermore, this new liberalism, I haven't got a name for it, also, I think, overstates the role of individual rights, and as I've argued already, understates the significance of rule by consent. Cognitive growth, freedom of inquiry, not accepting privileged knowledge, this tends to be fenced off by political correctness, and to some extent by the acceptance of a certain kind of relativity tied to identity, which effectively bans the scrutiny of certain privileged, I stress that word, identity collectives. I'm thinking here of the ban on cultural appropriation, which in a way is an extraordinary phenomenon, that cultural practices are specific to particular cultural collectivities and may not be used by any other culture. Now, bizarre outcome, number 1. In Canada, I just read this 2 or 3 days ago, at one university, there has been a demand that non-Indians should stop practicing yoga. Now, it seems to me, if ever there was a very successful cultural export from India, it's yoga. Many people practice it. I don't practice it, but I'm widely aware of people who find this quite interesting, or whatever reason they have for it. I think that's absurd. Also absurd is that non-Mexicans may not wear a sombrero. I think we can take this further and say non-Hungarians may not cook with paprika. Spaniards possibly yes, because they have their own paprika-based dishes, and so on and so forth. I think this is nonsense on stilts. Absurd in the extreme, which I find quite entertaining. I think it's also very dangerous. It means that it's on the way to creating cultural silos, fencing off particular cultures. It's also very strange that from the liberal mainstream, at least I haven't encountered it, nobody's standing up and shouting, "Stop this nonsense." Whereas I think that actually, if one believes in liberalism, then I think one has to believe in a certain intermingling of cultures. So just to continue, I've got to give myself about another 5 minutes. I think it's fairly clear what I regard as the central values of this present version of liberalism, the universalism that I've mentioned, human rights as they are currently defined, rule of law, but again I think increasingly only if the law underpins or is underpinned by liberal values, the equality of selected, possibly elected groups, clearly women, LGBT, race. Race is applied to particular groups only, primarily to non-European immigrants and their descendants. But the central focus of socialism, the eradication of material inequality, has been replaced by market allocation, which I think has resulted, I don't think anybody's going to question this, in very serious material inequalities. And the equality of identity is unattainable. Equivalence maybe, but equality, what does this mean? What does it mean for a Hungarian to be equal to an Austrian? Are we going to deny parts of our history, or what is this? Equality of respect, I can certainly see that, but equality in this simplistic sense, I think, is not there. Democracy, I think, is overwhelmingly focused on human rights and civil society and media freedom, as long as they operate within the self-defined liberal framework. There's a difficulty that I have with civil society, which to some extent replaces representative democracy. Who elects NGOs? I think I can leave the question there. Nobody is the answer. How much transparency are NGOs subject to? Oh, another illustration. Just this week, the European Union's Commission has approved this citizens' initiative, which is about launching Article 7 investigation against Hungary, is run by the European Humanist Federation. Who are they? I don't know. Transparency? No. Mysterious. I mean, I'm sure their identity will become more transparent with the passing of time. So, let me bring my thoughts to an end. What I'm suggesting is that liberalism has essentialized a number of propositions that it regards as immanent. And there's consequently a real danger of a monoculture. If you can't question things, then clearly that's the direction in which we will move. If anybody does argue, if anybody does question the values of this self-styled liberalism, proposing benefits from, let's say, the values of an ethnic identity, they'll shut it down. Note here that not all that long ago, including in John Stuart Mill's time, ethno-national identity was seen as emancipatory. It's not anymore. Try saying to somebody, I'm an ethnic Hungarian and proud of it. It won't go down terribly well in a fair number of circles. What lies behind all this, I think, is the rejection of the proposition made very forcefully by Isaiah Berlin, whom I continue to regard as one of the most important intellectual influences on me, is that some values are incommensurable. They cannot be reconciled. There will always be a conflict, let's say, between justice and mercy. It's one of the obvious ones, which means that democracy is about finding the equilibrium, about finding the balance. What I see is this belief, again, one that Berlin found extremely troubling, is the proposition that there can be such a thing as social harmony. That there is a society without conflict. There will always be conflict in a democracy. That's what a democracy is, to me, is about. So in a sense, what we're looking at is this liberal project, which is seeking to inculcate liberal ideals, liberal values into the population as a whole, to which there is resistance. And to my mind, this is a kind of colonial project with missionary zeal, an infantilization of society by a superior elite. So let's not be surprised by the growing gap between elite populations. Do we have an alternative, a possible alternative set of objectives? Well, I think in the first place, I think there's got to be a serious discussion which recovers democracy from its liberal monopoly. I think secondly, we must insist, I do, that all ideas, all political forces, all practices are contingent and are context dependent. They're not there forever, they're not immanent. Because if we don't do this, we essentialize our own views, which we then seek to impose on others. We should have respect for our opponents, and I think we also must have unfailing commitment to human dignity. Thank you for your attention.
Köszönjük szépen, professzor úr, bevezető előadását, és megkezdenénk a panelt. Szeretném először is a panel résztvevői ülésrendben bemutatni. Szent Iványi István nagykövet úr, aki a Magyar Liberális Párt külügyi szakértője, illetve Bába Iván egyetemi docens, a Károly Gáspár Református Egyetem oktatója, és a 2010 és 2014 közötti időszakban a Külügyminisztérium külügyi államtitkára a beszélgetőtársaim. Én Arató Krisztina vagyok, az ELTE AEK Politikatudományi Intézetében vagyok oktató. A téma körülöttünk van, a liberalizmusról beszél a politika, beszél a tudomány, és áthatja a liberalizmus kérdésköre, vagy esetleg válsága az egész életünket. Egy kis önreklámnak engedjenek itt helyet. A héten jelent meg a Magyar Politikai Rendszer című kötet. Innen nem nagyon messze a várban, a Társadalomtudományi Kutatóközpontban volt kedden ennek a kötetnek a bemutatkozó konferenciája. És a kötet első fejezete a politikai gondolkodásról szól, a magyar politikai gondolkodásról az elmúlt 25 év során. És a kollégám Mándi Tibor, aki írta ezt a fejezetet, mivel 20 oldalban nagyon nehéz lenne elmondani az elmúlt 25 év mindegyik politikai ideológiájának a változásait, úgy gondolta, hogy a liberalizmus ment keresztül a legjelentősebb változásokon az elmúlt 25 évben, tehát ezt az elmélettörténeti változást írta meg a rendelkezésére álló helyen. Hallottuk professzor úrtól, hogy a liberalizmusnak milyen mélységei és gyökerei vannak, de azt a szót is használta, hogy új liberalizmus, new liberalism. Tehát sokfajta liberalizmusról beszélünk. Én arra kérem beszélgető partnereimet, hogy egy 10-15 percben foglalják össze, hogy mit gondolnak ezekről a liberalizmusokról és azoknak az esetleges válságairól, vagy ha nincs több eszem, csak egy eszem, azt is kérem, hogy fejtsék ki, és akkor utána beszélgetünk.
Abban maradtunk, hogy a bevezetőt itt mondjuk el, és aztán majd az asztalnál beszélgetünk. Tisztelettel üdvözlök mindenkit, kedves elnökasszony, professzor urat, tisztelt jelenlévőket. Rendkívül provokatív ugye a cím, és rendkívül provokatív a téma is, és az ember csak óvatos lehet, hogy amit szikével kellene szétbontani, azt nehogy baltával próbálja, mert abból ugye súlyos dolgok következnek. Tehát engedjék meg, hogy ebben a rendelkezésemre álló 10 percben, ha szabad úgy mondani, néhány gondolati elemet, vagy néhány gondolatfoszlányt mondjak el, hiszen a liberalizmusról 10 percben beszélni, az mondhatnám azt is, hogy életveszélyes. A szakmámból eredően én egy sajátos aspektusról szeretnék egy kicsit részletesebben beszélni a liberalizmus kapcsán. Nevezetesen a liberalizmusnak a 20. századi hatásáról a nemzetközi kapcsolatokra. ha szabad ezt így mondanom.